compañeros, bienvenidos a un nuevo video aquí en Moverlord, bienvenidos sean a un nuevo video aquí en el canal, bienvenidos de regreso a un nuevo video especial, bienvenidos de vuelta a un nuevo video de debate, de discusión, de opiniones en la caja de comentarios que yo os estaré leyendo, porque el día de hoy vamos a ver el nuevo video de Classic Plus, Nunca Funcionará. Este video anda siendo bastante viral en este momento. De hecho, hasta me lo pasaron vosotros por Discord, por privado, por Instagram. Hombre, la verdad es que muy feliz y contento de que siempre me compartan cosas importantes de World of Warcraft. Y este es un video de esos. Así que el día de hoy vamos a reaccionar a este videito que sí dura bastante, y posteriormente os voy a dejar aquí en la parte de abajo en la línea de reproducción o inclusive en el video donde empieza mi opinión sobre el tema, ¿vale? Primero vamos a dedicarnos a ver todo el video y luego de eso pues ya vamos a opinar. Porque si no el video va a ser muy largo, así que nada, he activado lo que viene siendo los subtítulos para que todos entiendan de qué va el tema. Pues nada, vamos directamente al meollo del asunto, ¿no, señores? Voy a subirle al máximo y vamos a ver qué nos dice este buen creador.
Listen up, everybody. I have bad news. I don't think Blizzard knows what Classic Plus is. In fact, I don't even think World of Warcraft players know what Classic Plus is, what it could or should look like, whether it'll deliver leveling-focused content or just be a geared treadmill for the endgame, or if any of these options are even possible. Will it just be an incremental release of new raids and dungeons until we've power-crept anything and everything from 2006? Will it be zone expansions, leveling overhauls, new professions, all of the above? Or will it get inspired by old-school RuneScape and integrate a more curated sandbox methodology to its design? But to be honest with you, I think none of these things will work, and here's why. Think back for a moment to a different time. 2019, Classic WoW just released, and even then, the idea of what comes next has been a constant, a conversation in-game and not. And for the longest time, Blizzard has been about as vague about it as one would expect Blizzard to be. Truthfully, just like the players, they had no idea, and were comfortable in allowing their subscribers to relive the nostalgia with a few minor changes, not just of classic vanilla Warcraft, but also the expansions preceding it. Now we're past the original game's player peak and are seeing an eerily similar trend get repeated once more. This isn't surprising. Blizzard has essentially opted to repeat history. No one should be scratching their heads over why the active player counts aren't booming. And now their backs are thoroughly up against a wall, facing the very real possibility of labeling Warlords of Draenor Classic and releasing what is widely considered to be the worst expansion in the game's history. They need to think of something, anything, and fast. All of those quiet conversations from 2019 suddenly need to be acknowledged, actually acknowledged, not in a snide way like in Season of Discovery, but in a legitimate way, because most of the players left playing Classic aren't likely to transition to whatever retail WoW has become. Players and content creators alike are known to wax poetic about the future. All the unreleased content that Blizzard wanted to add in 2004 but simply didn't have the time. Yet today I have the same issues with those old conversations from 2019 as I did back then. None of them, for whatever reason, acknowledge the fact that World of Warcraft may just not fit this model, this Classic Plus concept. On its surface, implementation looks fairly simple, right? This worked, so do more of it. But why did this work? In a few of my videos, I said that Classic, the original, still holds up today because of the emergent gameplay that it birthed. From Dire Maul tributes to guild collusions and world buff orchestration, as well as the simpler things like lining up to wait for mob spawns and random pickup groups to raid a gnoll camp. The leveling experience is the best in any theme park MMO ever, and the interpersonal connections forged in the fires of tedious molten core runs were unlike anything in the genre, back then and as 2019 proved, still today. But if there's anything that Blizzard has fundamentally lacked the capacity to acknowledge, let alone replicate, is that emergence. Blizzard is compulsively obsessed with balancing out every single aspect of player-driven creativity and labeling it an exploit. Dire Maul runs would not exist in any version of WoW other than Classic and maybe TBC. I don't want to make this video about all the pitfalls of time-gated slop bullshit plaguing retail WoW's otherwise exceptional gameplay, so let's instead mention the fact that Season of Discovery was closer in philosophy to retail than it was to Classic. The gameplay was still Classic WoW, sort of. They had some creative ideas for class design and some not-so-creative shoehorning of abilities from future expansions. They repurposed dungeons as raids, which was neat, and they incrementally released the game with specific level brackets in mind. On one hand, this replicated the classic beta they claim to be inspired by, but on the other, it is more closely aligned to expansion launches. The level cap increases, the amount of leveling to do is very, very minimal and quick, with tons of catch-up mechanics to make sure that you're never more than a dozen hours away from doing the single new raid available with your friends for like a few weeks before fading back into the brush like Homer Simpson, only to return back for the next expansion, or phase. While this was a fun experiment and just about as inconsequential as anything else in WoW, considering most people playing it knew their beloved characters would be prone to rotting on these servers after a year had passed. Or maybe they'd give you the honor of transferring them to whatever incarnation of Classic they deemed acceptable. But now, it's over, and Blizzard needs to, for the first time in a long time, have the difficult conversation of vision and philosophy. What is Classic Plus as a project? It can't just be another iffy year of throwing half-baked ideas patchworked together by a tiny development team and seeing what sticks, especially when backed by the ever-concerning reality that all of it may be deleted and forgotten. After all, an MMORPG is a promise of persistence. It's the understanding that you are expected to put in a lot of time doing something and not have that time be devalued by future updates or game closures. Now today, that's not so much the case, as MMOs have become as fleeting as Diablo seasons, but I think WoW players were reminded of what an MMO actually feels like by having to exist in a version of their beloved world that wasn't perverted by some modern design sensibilities. For the first time, some players were able to experience what having player agency feels like. I think the eye-opening moment for a lot of those experiencing Classic for the first time wasn't some general realization of exploration or simple classes, but the broader understanding that at one point, Azeroth felt like an actual place, somewhere to exist in rather than log into. Now, I don't want to just let that semi-meaningless phrase sit there, so let me elaborate as bluntly as I can. This was, in part, because it was grindier, more long-term, and demanded you spend your time playing rather than logging on Reddit and complaining about how much you need to play. Sometime in the next 20 years, there was a player and developer-driven realization that MMOs, which require a lot of time, effort, and commitment, are actually bad. Eventually, due to this, we landed where we are today with retail, and quite frankly, most of the genre, where MMOs have become jobs, not because they demand 8 hours a day, but because they meticulously curate how long you can and can't play and earn something from that play. And the few MMOs that don't feel this way, such as old-school RuneScape that give their players the agency to set their own goals and spend dozens, hundreds, thousands of hours to achieve them without ever devaluing those achievements with future content, have been seeing a major resurgence. In a funny way, Classic WoW's success kind of laid the groundwork for that, the broad realization that this genre exists as time does. It is as inextricably bonded to the concept of giving it your time as you would anything in the real world. There's a reason MMOs were synonymous with second lives, not because you could play a character, but because you genuinely needed to be that character, spend time as them. That's why it's massive, that's why it's multiplayer, and that's why it's online. That's why there are open worlds and hundreds of things to do in them, and why of all video game genres, it's the one that had the most people form faceless relationships with one another through. Finally, whether you have 1 or 10 hours a day to invest, you want your investment to mean something. While classic WoW provided that initially, now we're back in that questionable limbo of where the hell are we going? A lack of reassurance is an MMO non-starter. That's why people are hesitant to jump back into a dying game, because why should you invest thousands of hours into something that is on the precipice of non-existence? Thankfully, we have the players to give some feedback. Unfortunately, to create a good game, you need agile, responsive, intelligent developers to take in that feedback and synthesize a correct answer. If game design was as easy as just implementing player feedback, then making games would be so unfathomably simple philosophically. But it's not. And as I said in a prior video, players are like patients at a hospital. They know when something is wrong, but they may not know how to cure it. Players know something is wrong. Very, very wrong. And now they are saying all kinds of stuff in an attempt to cure it, because as a hospital or a doctor, Blizzard has been dead silent for years. They have been leaving us on red, and we're dying over here. So while we have that one Classic Plus survey and the vague assurance that maybe it'll happen eventually, the more important question is, what will happen eventually? How will it happen eventually? What is Classic Plus to you? The easiest and most common response is it's just more classic, more dungeons, more raids, more endgame content, maybe a few unfinished zones in the original game, and that's sort of it. This will only work in the short term. This is an MMO, and what you're saying Blizzard should do is release the same thing over and over again. This is both something that I think will kill the game, but also something I very well see Blizzard doing, because if there's anything they are competent at, it's making instanced content. Even then, what does that look like? Are we settling for expansions with extra steps, new raids that eventually power creep the old ones? Or if you aren't for power creep, what would itemization even look like half a decade later? Would there be raids with no good loot for certain classes because that well has run dry? Or are we going full send on power scale? Will we be critting for hundreds of thousands, if not millions, like in retail? Stats can occasionally be multiplicative, especially in Classic, where secondary stats often scale additively with their percent-based implementation. I know that's a very granular example, but what does this item that gives plus 2% critical strike chance look like in a decade's time? Do new items give plus 20% critical strike chance, or are they still just as weak? Neither are tenable options. I don't see a reality where Blizzard is releasing copious amounts of dungeons and raids and not power creeping the game to all hell. Not because they're incompetent, but because when you have a game that's purely motivated by combat and power progression, you need to actually motivate the combat and power progression. Just look at Season of Discovery, a version they pretty bluntly, if slightly sardonically, called Classic Plus More. Other players have realized that just adding expansion content minus the systems and bracketed levels doesn't really change anything other than make more boring versions of expansions. So instead they look toward the single success story in this space, old school RuneScape. I call OSRS a curated sandbox, as I don't believe it is exactly what one thinks of when they think sandbox MMO. It's not open-ended, and it's not only emergent. It's curated. The developers explicitly develop content to synergize with other content. The skills interconnect, the bosses build on one another, and eventually the additive nature of the game creates for dozens of different paths you can choose to go on at any given moment. While a sandbox is open-ended conceptually, old-school RuneScape is more rigid in its structure, and the paths designed are done so, more often than not, intentionally. A curated sandbox. WoW isn't a sandbox, curated or not. It's a theme park, meaning the systems that hold it together are vertical and driven by erasure. It's inherently a more shallow and immediate game. That's phrased negatively, but there's a reason it became the most popular MMO ever. It works, and it can be incredibly fun. But these systems don't have the infrastructure needed to become additive in the same way a sandbox is. If old-school RuneScape content looks like this, a large orb of things to do, with every new update adding a new growth onto it, World of Warcraft looks like this. In Classic anyway, where the leveling is broad and driven by your choice of zones and dungeons and grinds, and then narrows down significantly once you hit max, as you are given one of essentially three options: grind professions for combat and gold, do raids for combat and loot, and PvP for combat and loot. You can do all of these things, but they aren't particularly deep or interconnected, are they? They're just kind of all roundabout means of doing the one thing that WoW has always been good at: killing shit. Even professions are all just a means to that end. The depth of content in WoW stems, as I've said, from emergent gameplay, roleplay, open-world battles, guild drama, world buff organizations, self-prescribed solo challenges for gold, and etc, etc, etc. These aren't pieces of developed content, but novel, creative approaches in engagement driven entirely by the player base and accepted by the developers. Instanced content on its own in a vacuum doesn't drive this. You can see what I mean by looking at retail or even Season of Discovery. There really aren't any good stories to tell because your only method of communication is driven by insular experiences, and any kind of strategic emergence is often undercut by the heavy hammer of Blizzard's intentional design. If this is Classic's content approach, then this is retail. It's as narrow and shallow as can be, even when the depth of class design is incredible and the actual instanced content is loads more nuanced. The methods through which you're allowed to play are more limited by contrast.
Hey, thank you for watching, and a special thank you to the members who support my channel. If you enjoy my content and want to become a member, you'll gain access to all kinds of perks, such as extra unscripted content, shoutouts, and more. Thank you, and back to the video.
So, Classic Plus. It can't just be raids and dungeons, right? That won't work for longer than a couple years. Players will eventually get sick of the same cycle of content. Don't believe me? Here's Season of Discovery's population chart, or the best that the players have managed to figure out due to Blizzard's secrecy over actual player counts. It peaked immediately and then drastically dropped off, even when they added a properly new raid to the game. This is in major part due to Season of Discovery being seasonal. It's in the name, and therefore on a timer, making players less likely to invest their lives into it. But also because if all Classic players want is a new raid, they would just play retail. Oh, but classes are too complicated. Don't worry, you can now press one button just like in Classic. Here you go. Is that it then? Is Classic Plus dead in the water? Well, there's another thing that made it to the water. Turtles. That's so stupid. I'd be remiss to not discuss the turtle of it all. If you aren't aware, it's likely the most popular WoW private server. Private servers are a funny thing for World of Warcraft because they're like harbingers of the future. They predict what's coming, whether it be Nostalrius leading directly to Classic WoW or the many Classic Plus incarnations that will lead into Classic Plus. Once Blizzard capitalized on releasing a classic version of WoW, private servers who did just that gave up their market to a slightly more consistent product. Everyone who wanted an old-school version of WoW could go and finally play that officially, and today, everyone who wants a Classic Plus has had some options to peek behind the curtain and entertain some possibilities. Turtle WoW has been a long-running project that sought to bring the most faithful interpretation of what a Classic Plus can look like, instead of just importing retail systems like Blizzard wants to do. Housing, really? Can you name a more fucking tone-deaf system than a fully cosmetic instanced housing system in Classic World of Warcraft? You can, it's called Transmog, and it was also on the survey. Regardless, Turtle WoW augments the classic experience by expanding zones, adding new ones, creating new professions, and thousands of new items, and so on. It's essentially Classic Plus in the most reasonable sense, and one that I think Blizzard could maybe pull off. Now, I know that in and of itself sounds pathetic. I think maybe the billion-dollar corporation might be able to match the quality of a few fans, but that's where we're at today. This is, again, not because Blizzard developers are incompetent. There's nothing inherently wrong with the development team, but because Blizzard as a whole has no connective understanding of what made Classic WoW good. And whatever filters down from management or their creative directors is so diluted and synthetic that it probably tastes like poison to the developers who are shackled to their desks and forced to implement another 1,700 recolors of the same mount onto the trading post. And history tends to repeat itself, with Blizzard suing the developers of Turtle WoW. This is expected. Everybody playing private servers must know, the developers included, that this is an impermanent detour. Naturally, the most competent people at Blizzard are their lawyers, so they can utilize this to snuff out the self-perpetuated competition before launching their standardized version. Now, that's not to say Blizzard's actions are unreasonable. It's their IP, legally, and they can very well do with it as they please. With that said, I feel as though there were ways to create a more amicable relationship with those creating a product that is at this point more conceptually and systemically interesting than anything Blizzard has made in like a decade. Remember, the people playing Turtle WoW are also going to be the ones playing your version of Classic Plus too. In my perfect world, approaching this situation as some developers have modding would lead to a better relationship with your fans, but I am not privy to the facts of the matter, so I will leave my speculation there. The lawsuit is undeniably legitimate and warranted. Instead, I am a lot more compelled to think about the reasons for all of this to come about in the first place. Private servers within the Warcraft ecosystem have always been responses to what WoW itself lacked, doing what Blizzard hadn't or couldn't. As mentioned, it started with Classic WoW and now is revolving around Classic Plus. Blizzard's inability to be even remotely agile as this lumbering, obese, megalithic corporation suspended in the air like an impotent Baron Harkonnen has put them in the undesirable position of needing to retroactively mend cuts that have already scarred over. They delivered Classic WoW years too late, and now they are likely scrambling to come up with a cost-effective Classic Plus. But even Turtle WoW has issues, conceptually I mean. It's a very interesting peek into what Classic Plus could be, but it's also a narrow one, demographically speaking. The population that has enjoyed it is relatively small by comparison to the one that Blizzard needs to attract to sustain a full-scale development of a different version of WoW. That's the second, slightly more sympathetic argument I can think of. Blizzard is between a rock and a hard place. If they need to create what amounts to be a sustainable amount of content for a theme park MMO like WoW, they're going to need at least 100 developers on the project. And suddenly, what was held together by shoestrings attached to rusty cogs, lubed up by stolen breast milk, is now a full-scale operation. One that needs a substantial budget and return to sustain. It may not be totally reasonable for the executives to greenlight such a project if we want a version of Classic Plus with a proper content cadence that allows you to play for as long as you did back in 2019 without immense content droughts. Then are you willing to shoulder shitty monetization schemes? The answer should be no. WoW tokens, which likely would be added, whether it be immediately or after enough players have sufficiently sunk costed their way into endgame rating, may also exist beside cosmetics. There's a reason why Blizzard is considering transmog, cosmetic overrides, as a system to include. We also have seen them cross-port models between versions, which allows them to do the same with the deluge of cosmetic glut populating retail WoW. Sure, this allows for some level of horizontal repurposing of outmoded content through cosmetic collection, but it also allows them to monetize it to all hell. This is not a novel realization. They added a fucking WoW token to Wrath of the Lich King Classic, which was literally just a re-release of an expansion. It was like 4 developers locked in a cage getting fed hamster food and working on a single Macintosh from 2007. That's hyperbole, but obviously the scale of these projects would be different by comparison. Blizzard needs that wide demographic to even consider a standard monetization model. Let's defer back to the initial topic. What is Classic Plus? Sadly, I don't have an answer. I've heard options and all of them sound holistically unconvincing. Adding some new zones and raids wouldn't be sustainable. It completely misses the point, the appeal of WoW. I think adding new leveling content would be very cool thematically, but a huge time investment for little return. I'd love to see new leveling zones and expansions on old ones, but that can't be the selling point of the game because for most players, it's a one-time experience. And ultimately, the third option would be to make WoW a sandbox, or as close to one as possible. Turtle WoW has already been leaning heavier into this, an effort to sustain pre-existing content while employing the additive formula of old-school RuneScape. It may be the only option that sees the game survive for longer than a year or two. But by doing so, would it even be WoW anymore? If we uproot the subgenre that it in many ways perfected and transition it into another one, how much of that DNA will still be there? In some ways, it's like the ship of Theseus. In an attempt to replicate success, we begin to slowly rip apart the core of the game, reshape it into the version that we always wanted it to be. But in the process, is it the original anymore? How can it be Classic Plus when the plus is subsuming the classic? I would still prefer this though. I would rather see Blizzard swing for the fences and attempt to synthesize the gameplay and design people love into a more sustainable package for the future. If you agree, let's think of what that could look like in a general sense. For one, the entire itemization process would need to completely change. There would need to be entirely new systems added to the game, more interconnected elements in its professions, perhaps even allowing everyone to be every profession and exponentially increasing the amount of time needed to level them up, kind of creating a RuneScape-esque progression. Adding dozens, if not hundreds, of new profession-specific items that enhance your gameplay, building up a world where you're just as likely to go to Stone Talon Mountains as you are Black Rock Mountain. Adding horizontal systems that aren't just facilitating combat, but rather act as entirely new avenues of gameplay with enough depth to mimic that of combat. Things that you're excited to log into and do, and spend weeks grinding without ever needing to touch any of the traditionally Warcraft endgame. And finally, having the foresight and confidence needed to exist alongside player-driven emergence. It requires such a deft hand, such a nuanced and impressive understanding of World of Warcraft that I'm not sure anyone can pull it off. Because that's what RuneScape is. The benefit of old school RuneScape is that it has always been that, but the understanding of how to harness this has only improved in time. Today, our developers are very in tune with the systems of the sandbox, but only after years of trials and failures. It took the game dying, arguably twice, and being born again to iron out a long-term vision. Blizzard has not communicated anything to anyone. I'd be surprised if even the developers know what the future holds for this yet unannounced but kind of announced project. How is anyone to feel confident that they're in good hands when they can't even see the hands holding them? It's a maddening process. If there's anything I will advocate for, it's to be honest with your interests and forceful with your intentions. We're not talking old school RuneScape here. Jagex has had well over a decade to become agile and responsive to their community, and has integrated a controversial but exceptional polling system that gives a voice to players that all generally agree on what old school RuneScape is, what its future looks like. That's not without plenty of drama, but a skiller, a top-end PVMer, and a new player can all identify the overarching identity of old-school RuneScape. The same cannot be said about Classic Plus. The community behind this concept needs time to evolve with it, but time itself is of the essence. There won't be a decade of mistakes because Blizzard's investment needs to be a lot more expensive to create a sustainable product. A sandbox, curated or not, is great at repurposing content and creating huge releases out of a comparably small amount of development time. Because old-school RuneScape is long-form, incremental, and ever-growing, the developers can release a piece of content that will take months to complete without people batting an eye because they know that it will always be there. It won't be deleted with a seasonal update or an expansion. That is the subgenre Diffie. Even vanilla WoW all the way back in 2004 never had this luxury. Things were certainly more relevant for a longer period of time, but at this point, that strikes me more as a happy accident than an intended piece of design. The fact that Molten Core gear remained somewhat relevant in Naxxramas could have very well been because Blizzard's developers had yet to fully grasp the intricacies of their own itemization, and we've seen as much in Season of Discovery, sanding down the rough edges of item design to facilitate a more linear progression. Now, I want to ask you if just a half-year cycle of patches adding a new raid, maybe a new dungeon, and perhaps even some overworld stuff to do, whether that be a zone expansion or new leveling content, would be enough to retain your excitement about the game. Not now, but years later. The benefit of a classic WoW release is that there are two enormous continents to journey through in your task to get max level. A single new zone or minor expansion doesn't add that agency. Hell, even a fully new continent doesn't add that, as we've seen with the expansions that followed. So when I say be forceful with intent, I mean that you should, as a huge WoW fan, consider what it means to be playing a Classic Plus. Not now or in a year, but maybe in 5 years, 10. What does the game look like? What does your gameplay look like? Whatever the answer to that is, I hope it's not yet another path to where we currently are today.
Bueno, una vez reaccionado a este video que se llama que el Classic Plus nunca funcionará, ahí les va mi opinión. Realmente yo siento que TurtleWow está haciendo un gran trabajo con demostrar cómo se hace un Classic Plus. Ahí les va, porque esto va de líneas temporales alternas que ni ustedes a lo mejor se habían dado cuenta. Todo esto inicia directamente con el agregado de dos nuevas razas jugables. Los altos elfos para la alianza y los goblins para la horda. Y dirán, ¿por qué este es el punto de quiebre? Bueno, simplemente porque esto nunca había pasado realmente en la línea temporal que actualmente estamos yendo o observando o disfrutando en el WoW Retail, ¿vale? Los altos elfos se convirtieron en elfos de sangre y realmente Silvermoon o Keltalas fue reconquistada para poder luego hasta la nueva expansión de Midnight reformada y reestructurada como su antigua gloria. Pero realmente TurtleWow está yendo por otros lados. Tenemos de ejemplo las nuevas zonas que agregaron en el nuevo parche de la 1.18.0 que se llama Northwind, Valor y Green Bridges. 3 zonas que realmente llegaron a Xerath de manos de Blizzard de manera totalmente diferente o inclusive ni siquiera llegaron. Por ejemplo, Northwind y Valor nunca llegaron oficialmente al juego, ¿vale? Eran zonas planeadas, eran zonas que a lo mejor desarrollaron de alguna manera, pero que realmente nunca llegaron. Fueron recortadas, eliminadas o olvidadas ahí en el tiempo. TurtleWow las trajo de vuelta desde las cenizas y las volvieron a agarrar, tío. También agregaron nuevas zonas totalmente reworkeadas en todo Azeroth, dando pues nuevo lore, nuevas misiones, nuevas ubicaciones para poder explorar Azeroth, nuevas mazmorras nunca antes vistas e inclusive nuevas raids. Que la verdad es que están haciendo un increíble trabajo, pero desde este punto de vista ya estás viendo que TurtleWow está yendo por otro lado totalmente distinto que Blizzard, porque por ejemplo está este Genomergan Liberation Camp, que es básicamente la reconquista de Nomeregan, pero en una ubicación cercana, un nuevo lugar para iniciar de los gnomos. Realmente Green Bridges no llegó como lo vemos aquí en TurtleWow, ¿sabes? Y no se han dado cuenta tal vez, pero si nos ponemos a observar un tantito lo que viene siendo el roadmap de TurtleWow 2025-2026, podemos observar que el parche 2.1.0, después de la 2.0, el brinco a Unreal Engine, este parche, hermano, demarca una línea temporal alterna totalmente fija. ¿Por qué? Porque aquí no existe un Silver Moon o un Keltalas reconquistado por elfos de sangre. Aquí existen nada más unas ruinas, lo que dejó hartas después de su paso en Warcraft 3. ¿Sabes? Aquí vamos a ver una nueva zona y una nueva ciudad para la Horda llamada Sulamán. Los Trollamani, güey. O sea, y pues bueno, esto ya demarca que TurtleWow está yendo por otro lado totalmente diferente y que realmente si en algún futuro que Blizzard ojalá no lo logre cerrar, que Dios nos dé vida a nosotros, podamos ver un Terra Allende totalmente distinto al que vimos en The Burning Crusade, o tal vez un Rasganorte totalmente distinto al que vimos en Wrath of the Lich King, con un Arthas más potente, más implacable, que invada realmente territorio de Azeroth, porque eso es también algo que siempre me ha frustrado de Blizzard y de las constantes nuevas actualizaciones o expansiones, por así decirlo, que realmente Azeroth ya quedó olvidado. Desde lo que viene siendo TBC, LK, realmente Azeroth no ha sido tocado casi en nada. Realmente ahí está alguna mazmorrita, alguna raid, ahí para que te devuelvas a Azeroth y la hagas, hermano. Pero realmente Azeroth nunca fue afectado realmente. Pero es que estamos hablando de eventos, hombre, de nivel cataclísmico, hermano. La Legión Ardiente está pasando por el Portal Oscuro nuevamente, desde Terra Allende. ¿Tú crees que las tierras circundantes al pinche Portal Oscuro no van a ser afectadas? ¿Que los pueblos o los lugares de Azeroth no van a ser cambiados? O sea, eso sería un puntazo para darle vida al Azeroth que tanto nos gusta de una manera brutal. Cambiando el nivel de la zona para poder hacerla de level más alto o más bajo. Cambiando totalmente su fauna o su flora. O de igual manera los enemigos que enfrentamos. ¿Vale? Que ya no sea, por ejemplo, en Pantanos de las Penas, pues un pantano, realmente haya secado el pantano para poder ser una estepa totalmente acá seca como desierto y que realmente el lugar cambie por la presencia de los demonios o de la Legión Ardiente. ¿Sabes? Para poder reutilizar los recursos a favor de su causa. Antes de inclusive visitar Terra Allende, Azeroth va a ser afectado. Y es lo mismo para Rasganorte. ¿Quién te dice que Cuna del Invierno o Claros de Tirisfal o las ruinas de Keltalas van a ser revividos, reutilizados de alguna otra forma con presencia del rey exánime ahí? Que realmente Azeroth se sienta vivo, hermano. Que Azeroth sea tu protagonista. Que Azeroth reciba el cambio junto con el nuevo contenido. Eso es lo que realmente TurtleWow está haciendo algo increíble, ¿sabes? O sea, nos estamos preparando para el parche Hammers and Talons que nos va a traer Grim Battle. ¿Tú crees que con Grim Battle no va a llegar cambios a Grim Riches o a esta nueva mazmorra de Retreat, de Dragonmar Retreat, perdón? O sea, o de humedales, quién sabe, de tierras devastadas. Es que realmente podría ser interesante ver esa línea temporal alterna, ver cómo se desarrolla, ver que Azeroth sigue siendo el centro de todo y que tú, cada vez que te crees un nuevo personaje a la hora de un nuevo continente que llegue, pues hombre, va a cambiar totalmente tu manera de explorar Azeroth. Eso estaría brutal, ¿vale? Pero esa es solo mi opinión. Yo realmente siento que TurtleWow está yendo por el camino correcto, haciendo lo que realmente es correcto, basándose en lore, ya sea de Warcraft 1, 2, 3 o en el WoW Vanilla. Y de ahí partir para poder explorar cada rincón de Azeroth y luego expanderlo mucho más allá, ¿vale? Quién sabe, esos cambios futuros con los nuevos continentes hechos desde cero vayan a ser posible, ¿vale? Y Blizzard lo puede hacer fácilmente. Blizzard tiene el dinero, hermano. Tal vez los del WoW Classic no tendrán el equipo necesario para poder hacer este gran megaproyecto, pero tienen el dinero, les pueden dar la inversión, les pueden dar los trabajadores, les pueden dar todo Blizzard a ese equipo para poder hacer realidad este Classic Plus que yo creo que Turtle WoW está haciendo de manera correcta. Es más, inclusive lo que vimos en Project Epoch también puede aplicar en este Classic Plus. Cuando llegue a alguna actualización tocha, tal vez una mazmorra, 2 mazmorras hayan recibido un reward total. ¿Por qué? Porque la historia lo demanda, hermano, que tenga que ver con cultiras, yo qué sé, hermano. O sea, posibilidades hay un chingo. Pero que Azeroth nunca deje de ser el centro de la historia. Nuestro Azeroth que queremos seguir explorando por cada puto rincón, hermano, que nos anda enamorando en este simple servidor privado. Ilegal, pero privado y genial, ¿vale? Así que, pues nada, esa es mi opinión, señores. Espero que les haya gustado el video. De igual manera, espero que dejen un buen like, comentar, suscribirse, por favor, si quieren más contenido de este estilo. Y nada, muchas gracias por ver este video. Sí ha sido un video bastante larguito, pero, hombre, yo creo que vale la pena, pues, dar mi opinión sobre este tema. Y yo creo que Blizzard tiene el dinero, la capacidad y las herramientas para poder lograr un WoW Classic Plus mejor que Turtle WoW y llevarlo al siguiente nivel. Ahora, de que realmente lo hagan, en mí no está. Pero yo aquí, hombre, estoy dispuesto con mi cartera a huevo que yo pago. Si lo logran hacer, si no, pues ni modo. Aquí vamos a seguir explorando otros servidores privados. Así que pues nada, muchas gracias por ver este video. Nos vemos hasta más, ver gente. Chao, chao.